For 10 years, no one heard my voice, until a reporter found my hidden diary. What he read not only changed my life, but reminded the world that I still existed. I still remember the sound of the car door shutting that morning's sharp final, like the slam of a cell door. The smell of leather from the passenger seat clung to me as I sat there, my hands folded tight in my lap. My son Michael was behind the wheel. He drove without saying much, just tapping the steering wheel with his fingers like a man trying to distract himself from something he didn't want to say out loud. We left my little terraced house in Hove just after breakfast, the house I'd lived in for nearly 40 years. I could still picture the worn grooves on the banister from my hands sliding down it each morning, the faded wallpaper Margaret had picked out before she passed away, and the sound of the kettle whistling from the kitchen. That house had my life stitched into every wall, and yet I didn't know it would be the last time I saw it from the inside. "Just a few weeks, Dad," Michael said, as he merged onto the A27. His voice was casual, but his eyes stayed on the road like he was afraid to meet mine. "You know, until we sort things out." Sort things out. Those 3 words rattled around in my head. What exactly needed sorting? Yes, my hip ached more than it used to. Yes, the stairs felt steeper than when I was 50, but I could still make my own tea, still tie my own shoes, still remember the phone number I'd had since 1974. Surely a man who could do that didn't need to be parked somewhere. When we pulled up to Brighton Haven Care Home, my first thought was that it looked nicer than I'd imagined. A cream-colored building with hanging flower baskets by the entrance, and big glass doors that slid open automatically when you approached. There was even a little bench outside where 2 ladies sat knitting, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. For a moment, I thought maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Inside, it smelled of polish and something faintly medicinal, like disinfectant, had seeped into the walls. The reception was tidy, with a fish tank bubbling in the corner. A young woman, behind the desk, greeted us with a smile that felt just a bit too rehearsed. Michael handled the paperwork, while I stood there with my walking stick, feeling like a piece of furniture someone was trying to find a corner for. When the matron clerk appeared, she had that professional warmth you learn in jobs like this. She spoke directly to me, which I appreciated, but I could tell she was scanning me the way a mechanic sizes up a second-hand car, checking for faults, assessing how much work I'd be. She led us down a corridor lined with doors, each with a little nameplate. I passed one room where a television blared a daytime quiz show, another where an old man slept in his chair, his head tilted back, mouth open. At the far end of the corridor, she stopped at room 17. It was fine, neutral walls, a small wardrobe, a single bed with a stiff-looking duvet, and a window that overlooked the car park. Someone had placed a vase of fake flowers on the dresser. The air smelled faintly of boiled cabbage from the lunch service. Michael set my small suitcase on the bed. "Like I said, Dad, just for a bit. You'll have people around, activities, it'll be good for you." He kept glancing at his watch. I realized he was in a hurry to leave. I wanted to tell him I didn't need people around, that I'd been fine with my own company, that Margaret had been gone for years and I'd made my peace with the quiet. But the words caught in my throat. I didn't want to sound desperate. When Mrs. Clark excused herself to fetch some forms, I turned to Michael. "How long do you think this will be?" "Exactly," I asked. He sighed. "We'll talk about it soon. It's just, you've been falling a lot. Emily's at university now. I'm working full-time, and I can't be there every minute." I nodded, though my chest felt tight. I wanted to remind him that when he was a boy with scraped knees and a stammer, I never once thought he was an inconvenience. I wanted to tell him that when his mother died, I stayed strong so he wouldn't have to see me break. But instead, I just said, "Right, I understand." The truth is, I didn't understand. Mrs. Clark came back with a clipboard, and Michael used it as his chance to slip away. He gave me a quick hug, more of a pat on the back. "Really," Anne said, "I'll call you soon, Dad." I stood at the window and watched his car pull out of the car park. It was a silver Ford Focus, newer than the one I used to drive. I watched until the red brake lights disappeared from view. That's when it hit me. Not just that I was in a care home, but that I was there alone, completely. The rest of the day passed in a haze. A nurse showed me where the dining hall was, though I wasn't hungry. I sat in a chair by the window for a while, watching rain slide down the glass. At one point, another resident, Mr. Thompson, I think, shuffled in and asked if I played cribbage. I said, "Maybe another time." That night, Lying in the unfamiliar bed, I listened to the muffled sounds of the building, footsteps in the hallway, the creak of someone's door, the distant clink of dishes being washed. I thought about my house in Hove, about how the hallway light would be on, and the radio would be playing softly in the kitchen. I thought about how Margaret used to hum as she washed the dishes. I didn't cry, not that first night, but I felt something heavier than tears settle in my chest, kind of quiet resignation. I told myself it was temporary. A few weeks, maybe a month. I told myself Michael meant well. I told myself I'd get used to it, but deep down, in the part of me I didn't let anyone see, I already knew this was the start of something I wouldn't be able to undo. They say you can get used to anything if you do it long enough. I suppose there's truth in that, but getting used to something is not the same as liking it. By the third month at Brighton Haven, I'd learned the daily rhythm of the place, the bells, the meals, the sounds of footsteps in the corridor, could almost tell the time without looking at a clock. Every morning started the same way, a soft knock on the door, and one of the carers would step in with a cheerful "Good morning, Arthur," like I'd just woken up in a seaside hotel. They'd hand me a cup of tea milk, no sugar, though I'd been taking it with sugar for 60 years. I stopped correcting them after the first week. Little battles weren't worth the energy. After breakfast in the dining hall, there was always some kind of activity planned. Bingo, arts and crafts, chair yoga. The staff meant well, but it all felt like filler, as though they were trying to keep our hands busy so we wouldn't think too much. I went along sometimes, just to break the monotony, but most days I stayed in my room, pretending to read the same newspaper for hours. Outside, the seasons turned without me. I'd look out my window and watch the leaves in the car park shift from green to gold to bare branches. I used to love autumn walks along the Brighton seafront, the wind biting at my cheeks, the gulls screaming overhead. Now I just watched gulls through double-glazed glass, the sound of their calls muffled. At first, Michael came by on Sundays. He'd bring a paper, sometimes a packet of shortbread. We'd sit in a little lounge by the front doors and talk about the weather, about Emily's studies at the University of Exeter. He always left before tea time. "Got to get back before it gets dark," he'd say. Then the visits became every other week, then once a month, and then, without any announcement, they just stopped. I didn't see my son for nearly a year. It wasn't just him. My granddaughter Emily wrote letters at the start, bright, chatty things about student life and her friends in Exeter. I kept them all in the top drawer of my bedside table, tied with a bit of string. But after the second year, the letters came less often. By the third, they'd stopped entirely. I told myself she was just busy, but deep down I knew the truth. Out of sight, out of mind. The other residents came and went. Some left because their families took them home. Most left in the back of a quiet van, under a white sheet. We didn't talk about it much, but you noticed the empty chairs in the dining hall, the rooms with the doors left open, stripped bare for the next arrival. My closest neighbour was Mr. Thompson, a retired postman from London. He had a booming laugh and a habit of slipping biscuits into his cardigan pocket for later. We'd play cribbage in the evenings, sometimes. One Tuesday, he didn't come down for dinner. By Friday, his room had a new occupant, a lady who coughed constantly and smelled faintly of lavender. No one explained what had happened to him. They never did. That was the thing about Brighton Haven. Life here was made of small vanishings, a face missing from breakfast, a familiar voice gone from the hallway. The staff carried on as if nothing had changed. We residents learned to do the same. I noticed my own world getting smaller too. In my first year, I'd walk down to the garden most afternoons. By the second, I found excuses to stay in too cold, too windy, too damp. The truth was, my legs felt weaker, my balance less certain. Even the short walk to the dining hall started to feel longer. I became background, just another old man in room 17. The staff rotated often. Every few months there were new faces, young carers from Poland, Spain, the Philippines. They learned my name, my tea preference, but not my story. No one asked what I used to do, who I used to be. In time, I stopped offering. The loneliness wasn't loud. It didn't shout at me. It whispered. It pressed in slowly, like fog filling a harbor. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Sometimes I'd catch sight of myself in the mirror and be startled. Who was this thin, grey man with the deep lines across his face? When did my shoulders start to slump like that? I'd think about my younger self, the man who could haul crates on the Liverpool docks, who cycled from Leeds to Scarborough just to impress a girl, who held his newborn son for the first time and felt like he could take on the world. I didn't recognize that man anymore. The only thing that still felt like mine was the diary. I kept it under my bed, inside an old shoebox, wrapped in a plastic bag in case of spills. Every night, after lights out, I'd take it out and write. Some nights it was just a few lines about what I'd eaten or what the weather was like. Other nights, I'd pour everything onto the page, memories of Margaret, my frustrations with Michael, the creeping fear that I was slowly disappearing. Writing became my anchor. On paper, I was still Arthur Bennett, a man with history and opinions, not just a patient in a care home. The pages didn't judge me. They didn't look at their watch while I spoke. But even that began to feel bittersweet, because the truth was, no one would ever read these words. When I was gone, they'd probably be thrown out with the rest of my belongings. My life, my thoughts, my regrets, they'd vanish as quietly as Mr. Thompson had. I didn't know then that someone would one day prove me wrong. If you've never been truly alone, you might think loneliness is about silence. It's not. Loneliness is about the wrong kind of noise, TV game shows you don't care about. The hum of fluorescent lights, the scrape of cutlery in the dining hall, all of it without meaning because none of it is shared. The diary was the only place where my world still had meaning. It wasn't much to look at, just an old leather-bound notebook I'd bought nearly 30 years ago in Dublin. When Margaret and I went there for our 20th anniversary, we'd found it in a tiny shop off Grafton Street, with shelves stacked high with stationery and the smell of fresh ink hanging in the air. I'd told myself I'd use it for something important. Then life happened, and it sat on a shelf for decades, waiting. When I moved into Brighton Haven, I packed it almost without thinking. I suppose some part of me knew I'd need it. The first entry I wrote here was short. The 12th of February arrived today. Michael says a few weeks. I don't believe him. Room smells like cabbage. I kept writing. Not every day at first, but whenever I felt something pressing against my chest that I couldn't say out loud. I wrote about small things. The way Mrs. Clark always wore too much perfume. The sound of rain against the dining hall windows. The gulls circling above the garden. I wrote about bigger things. My disappointment in Michael. The hurt of Emily's silence. The memories of Margaret that still made my throat tighten. And then there were the memories I didn't share with anyone. My childhood in Leeds during the war, when the air raid sirens sent us scrambling under the stairs. My years working on the Liverpool docks. My hands raw from the salt air and heavy crates. The first time I saw Margaret at a summer dance in Scarborough, her dress, the colour of fresh cream, her laugh carrying over the music. The diary became my confession box. I could write what I couldn't say. I could admit the bitterness I carried, the guilt over mistakes I'd made, the fear that my life had boiled down to waiting for the end. Sometimes, when I read back over older entries, I'd notice how my handwriting changed with my mood. On good days, the letters were neat and deliberate. On bad days, they were cramped and shaky, as though I'd tried to get the words out before I could think better of them. One entry in particular became my most guarded secret. The 9th of November, Michael told me today I was too old to matter. He laughed when he said it, like it was a joke, but I saw the truth in his eyes. I'd never told anyone those words before. Not even Margaret. It was the kind of wound you didn't show, because showing it gave it more power. But on paper, I could set it down and look at it for what it was. The sentence that had made me feel invisible. The diary wasn't just for sadness. I wrote happy things too, like the time I won a game of cribbage against Mr. Thompson with a perfect hand, or when the garden roses bloomed in a way that made the whole courtyard smell like summer. But those moments were rare. Hiding the diary became a ritual. I couldn't leave it on the bedside table. Too many carers came in, out, changing sheets or bringing tea. So I found a loose floorboard under my bed. It wasn't obvious you had to press down on one end to lift it. Underneath, I kept a shoebox wrapped in a plastic bag, and inside that, the diary, safe from curious eyes. Sometimes, late at night, I'd imagine what might happen if someone did find it after I was gone. Maybe a staff member would flip through the pages out of boredom, then put it aside, thinking it was just the ramblings of an old man. Or maybe they'd read it carefully, and for a moment, I'd be real to them more than just ruined as a setchi. That thought kept me writing. The staff never asked about it. Even when they noticed me scribbling in the evenings, they assumed it was a crossword puzzle or a letter to a friend. That was fine by me. The fewer people who knew, the better. As the years went on, the diary became a second heartbeat in my life, a quiet, steady rhythm, reminding me that I was still here, still thinking, still feeling. I didn't know it then, but the words I wrote in secret would one day walk out of that room and change everything, not just for me, but for people I'd never met. It was a Tuesday in late October when she first appeared. I remember because the wind that morning had been sharp enough to bite through the windows, and the gulls were circling low, as if the weather had grounded them. Her name was Sophie Harris, 22, maybe 23, with a head of chestnut-brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail and a way of smiling that didn't feel like the practiced kind you got from staff. She walked into the lounge that morning holding one of those phone cameras everyone uses these days, but a proper one, with a long lens and a strap around her neck. "Good morning," she said to no one in particular, though her eyes swept the room like she was cataloguing faces. "I'm the new volunteer, Sophie." Most residents barely looked up from their tea or crossword puzzles. New volunteers came and went. Some stayed a month, some only a week. We learned not to get attached. I was sitting by the window, pretending to read the newspaper. She spotted me almost immediately and walked over. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked. I shrugged. "Suit yourself." She didn't start with small talk about the weather or my health. Instead, she asked, "Do you like this spot because of the light or the view?" It caught me off guard. No one had asked me why I sat anywhere in years. I hesitated before answering. "The view. The gulls make better company than the telly." She laughed a real laugh, not the polite chuckle people use with the elderly. Fair enough. Over the next few weeks, Sophie became a regular sight. She wasn't like the others. She didn't rush from one activity to the next, or talk to us like we were children. She asked questions and, not just the easy ones. "What was the happiest day of your life? If you could relive one moment, which would it be? What's the thing you miss most?" I didn't answer most of them, but I liked that she asked. One afternoon, I noticed her photographing Mrs. Patterson's hands as the old woman knitted. Another time, she crouched by the garden roses, trying to catch the way the sunlight hit the petals. She was observant, and she didn't mind silence. She noticed my diary on the table once, though it was closed. "You write a lot?" she asked. "Just keeping the mind busy," I said quickly, sliding it closer to me. She didn't press. But after that, whenever she passed my table, she'd glance at it not with suspicion, but curiosity. One day in early December, we were in the lounge when she sat down beside me with her camera in her lap. "Arthur," she began, "I have a friend who's a journalist. He's working on a series about untold stories from care homes. I think you'd have a lot to say." I shook my head before she'd even finished. "Not interested." "Why not?" she asked gently. "Because people only hear what they want to hear," I said. "And what they want is the easy version, the one that makes them feel good. My story doesn't have a happy ending." Sophie tilted her head. "How do you know you're still here?" That silenced me for a moment. She didn't bring it up again for weeks, but she kept talking to me, kept listening. She learned that I used to work on the Liverpool docks, that I had once cycled from Leeds to Scarborough just to impress a girl, that I hated custard but liked apple crumble. Small details, but they felt like pieces of me being noticed again. By late January, she mentioned the journalist again. "His name's James Carter. He's local. He's good at listening." "I don't need another listener," I said, trying to keep my tone sharp. "I need my family." She didn't argue, but she looked at me for a long moment and said, "Sometimes, strangers are the ones who tell the truth about us, because they don't need us to be anything else." I didn't have an answer to that. Still, the idea stuck in my head. The thought of someone reading my words, someone who might understand, was both terrifying and strangely tempting. It was a Wednesday morning in late February when Sophie told me he was coming. She found me in the lounge, where I was half listening to a daytime quiz show and half watching the rain streak down the windows. "Arthur," she said, pulling up a chair, "James will be here this afternoon, just to meet you. Nothing formal. You can tell him to leave in 5 minutes if you want." I didn't answer right away. I looked at her, then at the rain, then back at her. "And if I don't want to talk to him, then you don't," she said simply. "But I think you might surprise yourself." I told myself I'd refuse, that I'd sit in my room, pretend to nap, and let Sophie explain that I wasn't feeling up to it. But when the clock reached 3 o'clock, I found myself in the small visitors' lounge near the entrance. my walking stick propped against my leg, my diary hidden under my sweater. I don't know why I brought it, habit, maybe, or some half-buried urge to let someone see it. At exactly 3:15, Sophie walked in with a tall man in a dark wool coat. He had graying hair at the temples, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of face that looked like it had spent a lot of time outdoors. "Arthur, this is James Carter," Sophie said. "James, this is the man I've been telling you about." James smiled, and it wasn't the quick, polite smile you get from people who are already looking past you. It was the kind that said he was fully here, paying attention. "It's an honor to meet you, Arthur." We shook hands. His grip was firm but not crushing. He started with easy questions: where I grew up, what kind of work I did, whether I'd always lived in Brighton. I gave short answers at first, watching him carefully. Some people ask questions because they're nosy, others because they want a headline. James didn't seem to be either. He listened without interrupting, nodding now and then, occasionally jotting something in a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. After 20 minutes, he leaned back slightly and said, "Sophie tells me you've been keeping a diary." I felt my shoulders stiffen. "It's private." "Of course," he said quickly. "I'm not here to take anything from you, but sometimes a diary holds truths that deserve to be heard. On your terms." I studied him for a moment. "And what would you do with those truths?" "I'd tell them exactly as you wrote them," he said. "No cutting corners, no sugarcoating. People need to understand what life here is really like, not just the brochures and the charity campaigns." His words lodged somewhere deep in me. For years, my life had been reduced to polite conversations about the weather or my health. Here was someone saying, "Your story matters as it is." I hesitated, then reached under my sweater and pulled out the diary. My hands felt heavier than they should as I set it on the table between us. "One page," I said. "That's all." James opened it carefully, like it was something fragile. His eyes scanned the first few lines of the page I'd marked, and then he began to read aloud. "The 9th of November, Michael told me today I was too old to matter." He laughed when he said it, like it was a joke, but I saw the truth in his eyes. His voice was steady, but I noticed a faint tightening around his jaw as he read the rest of the entry. When he finished, he looked at me, not with pity, but with something closer to respect. "That's powerful," he said quietly. "Not because it's dramatic, but because it's real. People will feel this." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. My words had been mine alone for so long that hearing them in someone else's voice felt strange, almost like they belonged to the world now, not just to me. We talked for nearly an hour after that. I didn't hand over the diary, but I read a few more entries aloud. He didn't rush me. He didn't fill silences with meaningless chatter. He just listened. When he finally stood to leave, he said, "Arthur, I'd like to write your story. Not just for you, but for everyone who's been forgotten in places like this. But only if you want me to." I didn't agree right away, but as I watched him walk out into the grey afternoon, I realized that, for the first time in years, I felt lighter. A week after our first meeting, James came back. It was a clear afternoon in early March, one of those rare days when the sunlight made the sea outside Brighton look almost blue instead of grey. He arrived without the coat this time, carrying only his small notebook and a recorder. "I thought we might try something different today," he said as we settled into the visitors' lounge. "What's that?" I asked. He glanced toward the doorway. "If you're comfortable, I'd like to read one of your diary entries out loud, with some of the other residents here to listen." The idea made my chest tighten. "Why?" "Because your words don't just belong to you, Arthur," he said gently. "They speak to experiences a lot of people here share, but never say out loud. Sometimes, hearing someone else's truth gives people permission to speak their own." I thought about it for a long moment. I'd kept my diary hidden for nearly a decade. Letting James read it to strangers felt dangerous, like handing over the only thing that was still mine. But then I thought about all the voices I'd heard fade away here: Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Patterson, people whose lives had shrunk to a quiet corner and then disappeared entirely. "All right," I said finally. "One entry, and only if I choose it." I picked a page from my third year at Brightonhaven. It wasn't the most painful one, but it was honest. James waited while I read it to myself, then took the diary carefully from my hands. Sophie had gathered half a dozen residents in the lounge. Some I knew well, others only by sight. A few staff members lingered at the back, pretending to tidy up but clearly listening. James stood in front of the small group and began to read. The 17th of August today, I sat in the garden alone. The sun was warm, but I felt cold. I watched a family visiting another resident, children laughing, a daughter brushing her mother's hair. No one came for me. I told myself I didn't mind, that I was used to it, but the truth is, I minded very much. The room was quiet, except for his voice. No one fidgeted or whispered. Even the staff seemed to hold still. When he finished, James closed the diary and looked around. Arthur wrote that 3 years ago, he said. How many of you have felt something like that? A few people nodded. Mrs. Carter, a widow who rarely spoke, murmured, every day. Mr. Blake, who was half deaf and often cantankerous, surprised me by saying, you get used to not being visited, but you never stop wanting it. The air in the room felt different after that. It was as if James had cracked something open, something we'd all been careful to keep sealed. People began to share small pieces of their own stories. Not full confessions, just fragments. A holiday they missed, a grandchild who stopped calling, the way Sundays used to feel before they were spent in silence. I sat there, listening, realizing that my words had been a key. I hadn't meant for them to be, but there it was. After the others drifted away, James handed back the diary. That was brave, he said. It didn't feel brave, I replied. It felt like I'd left the door unlocked. Sometimes that's all it takes, he said with a small smile. That night, I wrote in the diary again. Today my words were spoken out loud. They didn't break me. They didn't make me disappear. They made me visible. It was the first time in years I felt like I wasn't entirely alone inside these walls. It was mid-April when James came back with a copy of the Brighton Chronicle folded neatly under his arm. He didn't hand it to me right away. Instead, he sat across from me in the lounge, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It's out, he said. I stared at the paper like it was something fragile, already. Front page, he replied, sliding it across the table, above the fold. I unfolded it slowly, half expecting my name to be buried somewhere. In the middle, lost among adverts for fish and chips, or local theatre productions. But there it was, in bold black letters, 10 years alone. The unheard truth of Arthur Bennett. Beneath the headline was a photograph of me. I hadn't known he'd taken me sitting by the garden, my walking stick leaning against the bench, looking out at something in the distance. I looked older than I imagined myself, but there was something in my expression, maybe determination, maybe stubbornness, that I recognized. James had kept his promise. He'd used my words exactly as I'd written them, weaving them between short descriptions of the home, bits of my life before Brighton Haven, and quotes from other residents who'd spoken up after that day in the lounge. He didn't shy away from the painful parts, the loneliness, the dwindling visits, the feeling of being quietly filed away and forgotten. By the time I finished reading, my throat felt tight. I set the paper down carefully. It's honest, I said. That's the idea, James replied. And it's already getting a reaction. I didn't know what he meant until the letters started arriving. At first, just a few addressed to the care home, with my name written in shaky handwriting. Some were from Brighton locals who said they'd walked past the building for years, without thinking about what went on inside. Others were from strangers in London, Edinburgh, even New York, telling me they'd read my story online. They shared their own experiences: mothers in care homes, fathers in hospital wards, friends they'd lost touch with. Some offered friendship. A man named Peter from Manchester said he'd like to come visit. A retired teacher from Devon sent me a book of poetry, saying she thought I'd enjoy it. One envelope held nothing but a small drawing of a gull, with the words, "You're not invisible," scrawled underneath. The staff began to take notice. They'd hand me the post with raised eyebrows, some even lingering to hear me read snippets, aloud. For the first time in years, people here looked at me like I was more than room 17. And then, after nearly 4 years of silence, Michael called. I was in my room when the phone rang. A staff member poked her head in, saying, "Arthur, it's your son." I froze for a second, before taking the receiver. "Dad." His voice was hesitant, thinner than I remembered. "Michael," I said evenly. I read the article," he began. There was a long pause. "I didn't realize how bad it was for you. I thought you were fine there. You didn't ask," I replied. He didn't argue. His voice cracked a little. When he said, "I'm sorry," I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to forgive him instantly, to seize the chance for some kind of repair. Another part of me wanted him to sit with the weight of what had happened. "I'm glad you called," I said finally. It was the only truth I could manage. In that moment, we didn't make promises about visits or moving me out, but the line between us, frayed and thin as it was, had been touched again. In the weeks that followed, the attention didn't fade. A local radio station called to ask if I'd be willing to do an interview. A community group invited me to speak at their monthly meeting. Sophie joked that I was becoming Brighton Haven's most famous resident, but fame wasn't what I felt. What I felt was something I hadn't in years. Connection. My words, locked away for so long, had reached beyond these walls and found other people, people who wrote back, people who cared, even if they'd never met me. That night, I wrote in my diary. Today, the world wrote back, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged to it again. It's a strange thing, how change can creep up on you. For years, my days at Brighton Haven had been carved from the same stone: breakfast, the garden, lunch, the lounge, tea bed. Then the article came, and suddenly, the stone began to crack. About a month after the piece was published, James visited again. He was carrying not just his notebook this time, but a small cardboard box. "What's that?" I asked. "Mail," he grinned. "Well, that's what I'm calling it. More letters for you." Inside were envelopes from as far as Canada and Australia. One from Melbourne contained a photograph of a man standing in front of the sea, holding up a sign that read, "Arthur, we hear you." But tucked among the letters was something differenter, formal-looking envelope with the crest of the Brighton Council printed on the front. "Looks official," James said, handing it over. Inside was an invitation. The council wanted me to attend a community meeting about improving conditions in care homes. They'd read my story, they said, and believed I could offer a perspective that would humanize the conversation. I almost laughed at the phrase, humanize, as if I hadn't been human this whole time. Still, I agreed to go. The day of the meeting, Sophie helped me into my best jacket, the dark blue one with the brass buttons I'd kept for weddings and funerals. "You look sharp, Arthur," she said with a smile. James arrived to escort me, and for the first time in a decade, I left Brighton Haven, not for a doctor's appointment, but for something that felt important. The meeting was held in a hall above the public library. There were counsellors, health workers, and a few other residents from homes around the city. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, leaning on my walking stick. "I'm not here to make anyone feel guilty," I began. "I'm here because I don't want anyone else to disappear the way I did." I told them about the 10 years about, the birthdays passed in silence, the afternoons with no visitors, the conversations with four walls. I told them how easy it was for people to assume you were fine because you weren't complaining. By the end, I could see a few people dabbing their eyes. Whether it would lead to real change, I didn't know. But I'd been heard, and that mattered. 2 weeks later, Michael visited, for real, in person. I recognized him immediately, though his hair was thinner and his face a little heavier. He stood awkwardly in my doorway, holding a bunch of daffodils. "Hi, Dad." I nodded toward the chair. "Come in." We talked for over an hour about his work, his kids, my grandchildren, who were now teenagers, and even about Mum. He apologized again, more sincerely this time. "I don't want to make excuses," he said. "I should have been here. I didn't know how to face it." "I know," I replied quietly, "but you're here now." He visited again the following week, and the one after that. He started bringing the grandchildren tall, polite, a little shy at first, but curious. They liked hearing about when their father was young, especially the embarrassing bits. It was strange, seeing my family stitched back together in small, cautious seams, but it was something. And then, one afternoon in early summer, Michael surprised me with an offer. "Dad," he said, "I've been talking to the kids. We think you should come live with us." I stared at him. "Live with you? In London? It wouldn't be forever if you didn't want it." He rushed on. "But we've got the space. And you shouldn't spend another year here, if you don't have to." I looked around my room, the small bed, the wardrobe, the framed photograph of Mum on the nightstand. For years, this had been my whole world. And now, for the first time in a decade, I had a real choice. The move happened in July. The staff threw me a little farewell tea, with Victoria sponge and paper hats. Sophie hugged me tight and whispered, "You'll write to me, won't you?" When I stepped outside with my suitcase, the sun was warm. On my face, Michael was waiting beside the car, the boot open. As we drove away, Brighton Haven grew smaller in the rear-view mirror until it vanished entirely. Life in London was noisier, busier, full of interruptions after so many quiet years. At first, I found it overwhelming, the rush of the underground, the constant hum of traffic, the chatter at the dinner table. But slowly, I began to love it. The grandchildren would pull me into their games, or sit with me while I told them stories from my youth. Michael and I would share tea in the mornings, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about the past. I kept writing in my diary, though now the entries were less about loneliness and more about rediscovery. Today, I walked in the park with Emma. She said the ducks liked me. I think she's right. Had coffee with James in Soho. He says he's working on a book. I told him to write the ending before the middle. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table while Michael cooked dinner. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the air. "You know," I said, "if James hadn't read my diary, I'd still be in that room." Michael paused, spatula in hand. "Maybe, but you wrote it, Dad. You kept speaking, even if no one was listening. That's what saved you." I thought about that for a long time. Now, when I look back, I see those 10 years, not just as something taken from me, but as a kind of preparation. They taught me patience, resilience, and the stubborn belief that my voice mattered if it took a decade for someone to hear it. I still keep in touch with Sophie and a few others from Brighton Haven. I visit when I can, and every so often, I get a letter from a stranger who's read the article online, telling me my story reminded them to call their mum, or visit their dad, or write to a friend they've neglected. If that's the legacy of my 10 silent years, then maybe it wasn't silence at all. Maybe it was the clearing of a throat before finally speaking. And now, I speak, every day.